Continuing on in chapter 6 of Terry Eagleton's Ideology, we're now shifting. So we've looked a little bit at sort of this irrationalist tradition that Eagleton says, I have some problems with it, but basically he says that it starts with Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer is a reaction to this heavy sort of rationalism of Hegel, and Nietzsche now comes along, right? And Nietzsche is an enormous figure in 19th century thought and a big influence on 20th century thought, especially in the continental tradition, not really in the analytic tradition, but certainly in the continental tradition, and would be a big influence on people in the Frankfurt School, all kinds of thinkers that are largely associated with continental style philosophy look to Nietzsche for some. Heidegger, big figure in the continental tradition, was very influenced by Nietzsche and reacted to him and wrote a lot and thought a lot about Nietzsche. Very interesting thinker and pretty controversial too. Okay, so Friedrich Nietzsche, he comes along and he's he's into a lot of people. He's into Schopenhauer and Wagner, and very concerned as a young man when he's talking about tragedy. It's all about art, so he's deeply influenced by art as well. He shifts more or less Schopenhauer's big capital will, that big blind force that I talked about in the previous video. He shifts that over to talk about power. Nietzsche is really the philosopher of power, right? Now, what exactly is power? He talks about it in a variety of places, and so you can check that out. But I want to pull it back to what we've been discussing, namely how this relates to reason. What does reason and where does ideology fit in? So how is reason changing in the perception of philosophers? Well, we saw the big thing with Hegel and the gang, the rationalists. Everything's going to be part of reason. Even the world is swept up into this giant thing of the reason, the absolute. Reason now, as we saw with Schopenhauer, shifts, and it shifts again. Reason is really the way we carve the world up for, says Nietzsche, in the service of power. So reality really is deeply connected to power. Reason is, again, as Hume would say, it's a kind of tool. Reason is the tool of power. And a tool, right, like a hammer is a tool. It can be pressed into service, but a hammer doesn't critique itself. Tools don't critique themselves. So as a tool of power, a tool cannot critique itself. So reason can't really critique power all that well. It certainly cannot critique itself, like a critique of reason for Nietzsche is a very odd idea, but of course that's what Kant was all about, right? With his magnum opus, his main book was exactly that, a critique of pure reason. That is very strange for Nietzsche, to say that a tool can critique itself. So in this sense now, the mind, right, is something that edits and organizes the world for particular ends, right? So once again, reason is sort of pressed into the service of the ends and for particular pragmatic ends. Reason is a kind of delusion. It's a necessary one. It's not trivial. It's important. We need this sort of delusion generator that's pressed in the service of our ends in order to survive, both in a basic kind of way of like not walking and stepping like stepping off cliffs and things like that. Also to helping us cope, creating delusions, like comforting delusions. So, Nietzsche would say lots of things about morality, conventional morality. These are comforting conventions. God as a protector and as a loving kind of parental type image. These are kind of delusions that we cook up. Lots of philosophers in the 19th century started arguing, like Feuerbach, God and religious things are projections of kind of our insecurities. Freud, whom we'll meet later, he's all about that. The notion of projection plays a big role in his thought as well. But stay tuned. We'll talk about Freud a little later. So it's a necessary sort of delusion. We need it to survive. And as Eagleton said, ideology is at work everywhere, throughout Nietzsche's thinking. But, it's hard to always say exactly what we mean by ideology. We have seen it, one sense, the delusional nature, right? In this case, for Nietzsche, reason is got this delusional nature, and so ideology as fostering delusions is at work in Nietzsche. Also, Nietzsche says that this metaphysical world of timeless truths and values, right, that is pumped out by science and religion and philosophy, they offer this metaphysical, tranquil world of essence. I guess Plato would say the world of essences and ideas and all these kinds of things and values, right? They're timeless, right? So it's this nice, calm territory that Nietzsche would say, you can retreat into it. You're the nihilist. You reject the world, right? So nihilists for a Nietzschean is they hide from the real world. They reject the real world. They hide here, they run off into this sort of fake metaphysical world. They're afraid of the real world. And the real world is like real, it's changing, it's bound up with power. And that's the world of life. That's where the living are, is in the world of change and the world of power. So, and the world of changing and power, that's the world of life. And life is, acquisition, appropriation. It's a pretty rough kind of view, and overcoming. And as Eagleton points out, kind of one of his little jokes, he said, it's kind of interesting how Nietzsche's view of life looks a lot like the capitalist notion of the marketplace. And in that sense, I think he's got a bit of a point here. So that the Nietzschean thing is, very individualistic, and of course it leads into a variety of his other concepts, like the Übermensch and things like that. But, so it's not really a collective notion. Nietzsche had big problems with collectivity, like called them herds, and people who get into these kind of collectivities of religion and science, they're all, again, not surprising, he's going to think they're weak. Why? Because they're afraid of really looking at their values and things like that. They just accept these timeless truths and they take refuge in them. All right. Now, there's, we don't have, says Nietzsche, any kind of God's eye view, which sometimes he refers to this lack of the God's eye view, is it's just perspectivism. That's all we got. We just have perspectives on reality, and reality, again, is bound up with power. So every perspective is bound up with power. You don't have any kind of God's eye view. In this, and so he says, look, a lot of people in the postmodernists have taken Nietzsche and run with this, that everything, Foucault is sort of the philosopher of power, and that all ideology, or, all ideology and all rationality, everything is just a mask of power. And he says, this can be taken to extremes. Where, and it's interesting, he makes this comment in about 1993, and I think it's still, you hear people talking like this today. He says, in its American form, he says that, eventually, with everything being a mask of power, there's no, how does he put it, that the belief that life in a Siberian salt mine is preferable to the current American way of life. And he says that, 1993, and again, we still hear people kind of saying stuff like this. He thinks that's way over the top. He thinks Nietzsche's onto something. Yes, there are reason. Again, we've seen that Eagleton is sympathetic, extremely sympathetic to the notion that there's no pure reason and it's bound up with interest. But to say that it's just this sort of total nightmare that we live in of domineering powers, he thinks, it's a bit, actually a lot over the top. But we don't want to dismiss this, okay? So he does think that there's a lot to be said, but he also thinks that we have to be careful about terms like objectivity and neutrality. And before he goes into Freud and discuss some other thinkers, he stops off and talks a little bit about neutrality. He says, yes, it's true that the people who've been, as he said, the sellers, the peddlers of objectivity have been, they're really just selling, for the most part, their own interest-laden views as objective views, right? So I may have particular things that I want you to believe, but I sell it as objective. And we've seen this in this notion of a kind of fake objectivity, where it's just a particular view of the world being sold as if it's an objective view and disinterested. Oh no, I have no particular interest. Here's how things should be. And it really is just an expression of a particular interest. But he said just because the notion of complete interest-free objectivity is questionable, that doesn't mean that we should, think all things, we should always try to be completely neutral. He thinks there's been sort of an overselling of this, and people have bought into this, that in order to be objective, you eventually have to sort of strip yourself and be completely neutral. And I think that's an important point to stress, that you can be non-neutral and objective at the same time. And what does that really mean? Well, you might say something like, okay, there's lots of conflicts around the world and there's lots of heated discussions about them. I can discuss them and be non-neutral. In other words, I take a stand. I have a particular side, like in, let's say, a conflict, I have a particular side I'm on, but I'm objective in the way I look at the conflict. And what would that mean? As I take a particular stand, I make sure I stick as much to the facts as I can. I never distort the facts. Well, nothing's perfect, but one argues to try to stick as close to the facts. And when one makes an inference to which side is better or worse, one is aware that that's an inference made, and that's where things can be challenged. So you try to come to as much agreement on what is supposedly objective, namely the facts, and then be well aware of where you bring the values in and make those kinds of judgments. So you can be, very much non-neutral and objective. So we don't have to think that being objective just means we have no real inklings or leanings or interests or whatever, and then just kind of throw our hands up and say it's all impossible. And so we don't deify our own sides, we don't demonize the other side, but nonetheless we still take sides and we try to be objective about both sides. And this also, we don't perform too many abstractions where we say, when clearly most of the evidence fits one way and very little fits the other, and then we abstract and say something like, well, there's two sides to this problem and there are people on both sides. That's kind of a way that an abstraction, as we've seen, that's that ideological type of abstraction of the synecdoche form, where it's taking apart for the whole, and so and sometimes taking apart for the whole is abstracting from the whole. So I abstract from all the evidence and all that, and just purely say, is there non-zero evidence on both sides? And if the answer to that is yes, I stop there and I say, well, each side has evidence, and ignore or abstract from the fact that maybe one side has tons of evidence and the other doesn't. That's another kind of sort of ideological thing that Eagleton is trying to say, do that. And again, trying to stress that objectivity doesn't mean complete neutrality. All right. That's about all I wanted to say of that. Interests, as Eagleton then also goes on to point out, they're deeply a part of us. We've seen this in a variety of thinkers. And that he is sympathetic to this view. He thinks it's a good position that humans are, thinkers that have, as Gramsci and a variety of other people have argued, humans are by definition biological creatures that just have interests built right into them. And our reasoning has interests built right into it. We have a primordial kind of frame of deep pre-reflective interests. There's nothing wrong with that. And but we also have interests that are not these deep primordial, and we shouldn't allow this flattening. So he thinks it's a kind of hierarchy. So he's a little old-fashioned in this, because hierarchies were kind of regarded as bad according to postmodernists. They wanted to sort of flatten things out. Whereas Eagleton is saying, look, we have this primordial frame of deep interest. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just kind of who we are. And you can't really imagine those away. That's kind of part of who we are. But there's lots of interests that we can imagine. And he uses some examples of, he doesn't really give us good examples of the primordial ones, but he uses the example of, some kind of act of aggression or military thing. That is a kind of interest or desire that we can imagine away. We can move away from those kinds of things. Even if aggression is kind of natural, we can imagine our way out of these kinds of things. And so we can reject that postmodernist move that kind of wants to flatten everything and says there's no real critique you can make amongst interests or just other than reason. So I think Eagleton still has that old-fashioned notion of reason can really do some critiques of passions, and it's not just a purely neutral instrument. And he also takes a little bit of issue with Stanley Fish, who a thinker, an American pragmatic thinker, who does sort of have this more of a flattened notion of you can't really critique an interest unless you can completely stand outside it. And he thinks, oh, that's kind of a residual of Kantianism, when, that somehow you could critique things from this neutral point of view. And if you declare that you can't do it, well, then you can't critique interests. That, Eagleton thinks, is problematic. And a number of thinkers do kind of, he says, like Stanley Fish, subscribe to that. Well, since you can't critique interests without standing outside of them, and you can't stand outside of all interests, well, then you can't really critique interests. Eagleton basically rejects that kind of thinking. And he says, even Aristotle felt that part of the happy life was the critique of interests. That was built right into his philosophy and his virtue ethics in the Nicomachean Ethics. But again, and he says, Eagleton, again, just before he then moves on to Freud, says, look, if we do accept that postmodernist notion of you can't critique interest, then what are you left with? You don't really have any discussion left. You're kind of left with, either dominating people sort of in some kind of physical aggression, or through maybe some rhetorical manipulation, right? And so it's a form of domination. We're left, as he says, that's kind of what he calls a violent condition. And he thinks that the liberal pluralist, right, is right, that we have to talk these things out. And there is a way to get better conversations once we strip them of these hidden forms of domination. Where it's not the case that when we start talking about what interests are, some privileged group has already gotten to define what an interest is. We have to get it where everybody agrees that nobody has the right to just declare what rational and real interests are and thereby exclude voices from the group. Okay, so that's going to bring that to a bit on Nietzsche to an end, and sort of the way it leads into postmodernism and some of Eagleton's reactions. But stay tuned for the next video, where I'll continue on in chapter 6, and we'll look a little bit at Freud and then move on to Searle. See you next video.